The scream tore through the forest before the moon had even finished rising. Elena Voss stood frozen at the center of the stone circle, her heart slamming against her ribs, as 300 pairs of glowing eyes turned toward her at once. The blood moon ceremony was supposed to be the happiest night of her life. Instead, it was about to become the night that broke her in half. Alpha King Damian Ashgrove stood only a few feet away from her, his broad shoulders rigid, his jaw locked tight. Moments ago, the bond had ignited between them, a burning thread of fate that connected her chest to his. She had felt it rush through her veins like fire and lightning combined, a force so powerful it made her knees buckle. She had looked up at him with hope shining in her eyes, certain that he felt the same overwhelming pull. He did not. Damian's eyes, usually a warm shade of amber, had gone cold and distant. The pack elders around them exchanged uneasy glances. The silence stretched so long that Elena could hear her own pulse hammering in her ears. Then he said the words that would change everything. "I reject the mate bond." The words landed like a blow. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Elena's whole body went numb. For a moment she thought she had misheard him, that the wind had twisted his voice into something cruel. But when she looked into his eyes again, she saw no confusion there, only a hard, unshakable resolve. "Damian," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind moving through the trees. "Do you understand what you are saying?" "I understand perfectly," he said, his tone flat, controlled, as if he were reciting a line he had rehearsed 100 times in his head. "I cannot accept this bond." Elena felt the ground tilt beneath her feet. The bond, once a warm golden thread linking her heart to his, snapped violently, sending a wave of pain through her body so intense that she staggered backward. Gasps rose from the crowd again, and somewhere in the back, an elder murmured a prayer under his breath, as though witnessing something unnatural. She caught herself before she fell, refusing to give him the satisfaction of watching her collapse. Around them, pack members whispered urgently to one another. Rejections were rare. They were said to bring misfortune to an alpha's reign, a curse upon the pack itself. But nothing mattered to Elena in that moment except the humiliation burning through her like acid. "Why?" she asked, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to keep it steady. Damian did not answer immediately. His gaze flicked to the council members standing near the throne, especially to an older woman named Margaret Holt, the head of the Ashgrove Council, whose expression was unreadable but whose presence radiated quiet command. Elena understood in that instant. This wasn't only about him. There were expectations weighing on him, political marriages whispered about for years, alliances that a fated bond with an unknown woman could destroy. But understanding the reason did not lessen the pain. "You will always be respected within these lands," Damian said finally, his voice tight, almost mechanical. "But I cannot make you my queen." Elena felt something inside her harden, like water freezing over in an instant. She lifted her chin, refusing to let a single tear fall in front of the pack that had just watched her be discarded like something unwanted. "Then I release you as well," she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her chest. "Do not expect me to wait for you to change your mind." A murmur of surprise moved through the crowd. It was almost unheard of for a rejected mate to respond with such composure, such open defiance. Damian's eyes flickered, something unreadable passing behind them, but he said nothing. He simply nodded once, a stiff, formal gesture, and turned away, retreating toward the stone steps of the ceremonial platform. Elena did not wait to watch him disappear into the crowd. She turned on her heel and walked in the opposite direction, her back straight, her steps deliberate, even as her entire body screamed in agony from the broken bond. Each step felt like walking through fire, her wolf howling inside her, desperate for the connection that had been so cruelly severed. By the time she reached the edge of the forest, her legs finally gave out. She fell to her knees beside an old oak tree, gripping the rough bark as sobs finally broke free from her chest. The pain was unlike anything she had ever experienced, not just emotional but physical, as though her very soul had been torn in half and left to bleed in the darkness. She did not know how long she stayed there, curled against the tree, shaking with the aftershocks of rejection. When she finally lifted her head, the moon had shifted further across the sky, and the ceremony grounds behind her had gone silent, the crowd long dispersed. She was alone in the cold night air, alone with a wound that no healer in the pack could mend. A twig snapped behind her, and she spun around, her instincts flaring despite her exhaustion. A young woman with soft brown hair and kind eyes stood a few feet away, her hands raised in a gesture of peace. It was Nora Whitfield, one of the pack's healers, someone Elena had spoken to only briefly during her time in the Ashgrove territory. "I am not here to hurt you," Nora said gently, stepping closer with slow, careful movements. "I saw what happened. I wanted to make sure you were not badly injured." Elena wiped her face quickly, embarrassed to be caught in such a vulnerable state. "I will survive," she said, though her voice cracked slightly on the last word. Nora knelt beside her, offering a small vial filled with a pale liquid. "This will ease the physical pain, at least for tonight. I cannot heal what he broke inside you, but I can help your body cope with the shock." Elena hesitated before accepting the vial, drinking it in one motion. The bitter taste spread across her tongue, followed almost immediately by a dulling of the sharp ache in her chest. It was not gone, but it was bearable now, like a wound wrapped in bandages instead of left open to the air. "Thank you," Elena whispered. Nora studied her for a long moment, sympathy written plainly across her face. "For what it is worth, I do not believe he did this because he does not care. I believe he did this because he is afraid of what caring would cost him." Elena let out a bitter, humorless laugh. "That does not make it hurt any less." "No," Nora agreed softly. "It does not." The two women sat together in silence for a while, the only sound the distant rustle of leaves and the occasional call of a night bird somewhere deep in the trees. Elena's mind raced through the events of the ceremony over and over, replaying the moment the bond ignited, the moment Damian's expression shifted from surprise to something colder, more calculated. She thought of the years she had spent believing that finding her fated mate would finally give her a sense of belonging, a place where she was wanted without question. Instead, she had been humiliated in front of an entire pack, discarded before she had even had the chance to understand what the bond truly meant. "I need to leave this place," Elena said finally, her voice quiet but resolute. Nora did not argue. She simply nodded, understanding the weight behind those words. "Where will you go?" "I do not know yet," Elena admitted. "But I cannot stay here, not after tonight. I refuse to become a symbol of pity, whispered about in corners for the rest of my life." Nora reached out and squeezed her hand gently. "Whatever you decide, I hope you find peace. You deserve far more than what happened here tonight." Elena managed a small, grateful smile, though the sadness in her eyes remained. She rose slowly to her feet, brushing dirt and leaves from her clothes, feeling strangely lighter despite the pain still lingering in her chest. Perhaps it was the potion Nora had given her, or perhaps it was simply the decision forming solidly in her mind, a decision to leave behind everything that reminded her of the humiliation she had suffered. She did not return to her small cabin near the edge of the parklands that night. Instead, she made her way directly to the stables, where a single horse remained saddled from an earlier errand. She packed only what she could carry quickly, refusing to waste another moment in a place that had rejected her so completely. As she rode away from the Ashgrove territory under the fading light of the setting moon, she allowed herself one final glance backward at the towering silhouette of the park's great hall, the place where her fate had been decided and then discarded within the same breath. She did not know it yet, but somewhere behind those walls, Damian Ashgrove stood alone on his balcony, staring out into the darkness, his chest aching with a pain he refused to acknowledge, a pain that would only grow heavier with each day that passed without her. For now, though, Elena rode forward into the unknown, leaving behind the broken bond, the humiliated tears, and the king who had chosen pride over fate. She did not look back again. Whatever waited for her beyond the borders of Ashgrove territory, she was determined that it would be built on her own strength, not on the fragments of a bond that had shattered before it ever had a chance to grow. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but for the first time since the ceremony, Elena felt something other than despair settle into her chest. She felt the faint, stubborn spark of determination. And that spark, small as it was, would carry her further than she ever imagined possible. 3 months had passed since Elena left the Ashgrove lands, and the border town of Ridgemere had become the closest thing to a home she had known since that night. She lived in a small stone house at the edge of town, worked long hours at a trading post, and had trained herself, slowly and painfully, to stop reaching for a bond that no longer existed. She was restocking shelves at the trading post on a grey afternoon when the sound of horses thundering into town pulled her attention toward the window. A convoy of riders in deep blue and silver colors moved through the main square, their banners marked with the emblem of a crescent and sword, a symbol Elena recognized instantly as belonging to the Thornwood kingdom, a territory that had long been at odds with the Ashgrove pack over disputed hunting grounds and old grievances neither side seemed willing to forget. She watched from behind the counter as the riders dismounted, their leader commanding immediate attention despite saying nothing at all. He was tall, with dark hair pulled back from a sharp, composed face, and an air of quiet authority that seemed to settle over the entire square the moment his boots touched the ground. Elena had never met King Alaric Thornwood in person, but she had heard enough stories to recognize him without needing an introduction. She quickly returned to her work, assuming the visit had nothing to do with her, a simple trade negotiation between rival territories that happened occasionally in neutral towns like Ridgemere. She was wrong. Later that evening, as she closed the shop and prepared to walk home, a young man approached her, dressed in the same deep blue colors as the earlier convoy. "Miss Voss," he asked politely. Elena stiffened, surprised that anyone in this town knew her name beyond casual acquaintance. "Yes. King Alaric requests a brief meeting with you, if you are willing. It concerns a matter of trade route safety, nothing more." Elena studied the young man carefully, searching for any sign of deception, but found none. Curiosity, cautious but present, stirred within her. "Very well," she said finally. "Lead the way." She was brought to a modest inn at the edge of town, where King Alaric sat alone at a corner table, a single candle flickering between them as she took the seat across from him. Up close, his eyes were a deep shade of grey, calm but observant, missing nothing as they studied her. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice steady and measured. "I understand this town serves as a crossing point for goods moving between our territories. I am told you manage much of that trade personally." "I do," Elena replied cautiously. "I would like your insight," Alaric continued. "Recent reports suggest increased danger along the northern route, possibly linked to bandits operating near the old forest border. Your experience with these parts could prove valuable in adjusting our trade agreements to ensure safer passage for both our peoples." Elena blinked, surprised by the directness of the request. She had expected diplomatic maneuvering, perhaps subtle attempts to gain leverage over Ashgrove interests through her knowledge. Instead, she found a straightforward request for practical expertise, treated with genuine respect rather than condescension. "I can share what I know," she said slowly. "Though I am curious why a king would seek information from a shopkeeper rather than his own scouts." A faint smile crossed Alaric's face, the first shift of warmth she had seen from him. "Scouts report what they observe. You understand the patterns, the timing, the reasons behind the danger. That kind of understanding is far more valuable than simple observation." Their conversation stretched well into the evening, moving from trade routes to broader discussions about the tensions between their territories, the history behind decades of mistrust, and the challenges of maintaining peace along contested borders. Elena found herself surprised by how easily the conversation flowed, how Alaric listened intently to her opinions rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak. By the time she left the inn that night, she realized she had spoken more freely with a stranger in a few hours than she had with anyone since her arrival in Ridgemere. Over the following weeks, Alaric's visits to Ridgemere became more frequent, always framed around legitimate matters of trade and border security, though Elena began to suspect there was more drawing him back than simple diplomatic necessity. Their meetings gradually shifted from formal discussions at the inn to longer walks through the town, conversations stretching late into the evening beneath lantern light. She learned that Alaric had become king at a young age after the sudden loss of his father, forced to navigate a kingdom torn by internal disputes and external threats before he had fully grown into the role expected of him. He carried the weight of his crown with quiet determination, never boasting of his position, never expecting special treatment because of it. In turn, Alaric slowly learned pieces of Elena's past, though she remained guarded about the details of her rejection, offering only vague mentions of a difficult chapter she had left behind in another territory. He never pressed her for more than she was willing to share, respecting the boundaries she placed around herself, something she had not expected from a king accustomed to obedience rather than patience. One evening, As autumn winds began sweeping through Ridgemere, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and distant rain, Alaric found her sitting alone near the edge of the river that marked the town's boundary. She had come there often since arriving, finding a strange comfort in the sound of moving water, a reminder that time continued forward no matter how much pain lingered behind. "You come here often," Alaric said, settling onto the grass beside her without waiting for an invitation. "It helps me think," Elena admitted. "Or perhaps it helps me stop thinking, I am not entirely sure which." Alaric watched her for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. "Whatever happened to you before you arrived here, it left a mark that has not yet faded." Elena stiffened slightly, surprised by his perceptiveness, though she did not deny his observation. "It is not something I speak of easily." "You do not have to," Alaric said gently. "I only wish to understand you better, in whatever way you are willing to allow." Something about the sincerity in his voice loosened the tight grip Elena had kept around her past for months. Slowly, hesitantly, she began to share fragments of her story, the ceremony, the ignition of a bond she had believed would finally give her a place to belong, and the crushing rejection that followed in front of hundreds of witnesses. Alaric listened without interruption, his jaw tightening with quiet anger as she described the humiliation she had endured, though he said nothing until she finished speaking. "He was a fool," Alaric said finally, his voice low but firm. "Any man who would discard a bond like that, in front of his entire pack, understands nothing of what true partnership requires." Elena felt tears threatening to rise, though this time they came from a strange mixture of lingering pain and unexpected relief at finally being heard without judgment. "I have spent months trying to convince myself I no longer care what he thinks." "You do not need to convince yourself of anything," Alaric said. "You survived something that would have broken many people entirely. That alone speaks to a strength most never have the chance to discover within themselves." They sat together in silence for a while, the sound of the river filling the space between them, neither feeling the need to rush toward more words. Eventually, Alaric rose to his feet, offering his hand to help her stand as well. "I should return to my convoy before nightfall," he said. "But I find myself hoping this will not be the last time we speak so openly." Elena accepted his hand, feeling a warmth spread through her at the simple gesture, so different from the coldness she had experienced during her final moments with Damian. "I would like that as well," she admitted quietly. As the weeks turned into months, their bond grew steadily, built not upon fate or ignited threads of destiny, but upon shared conversations, mutual respect, and a growing understanding that neither had expected to find during what began as simple diplomatic visits. Elena found herself looking forward to Alaric's arrivals with an anticipation she had not felt in a long time, a feeling entirely separate from the desperate ache the broken mate bond had once left behind. Word of their growing closeness eventually reached beyond Ridgemere's borders, carried through traveling merchants and wandering messengers who spread news across territories with little regard for discretion. It was only a matter of time before whispers of the friendship between the Thornwood king and the rejected Ashgrove mate reached the ears of those within Damian's own court. Meanwhile, far from Ridgemere, within the walls of Ashgrove's great hall, Damian Ashgrove had begun noticing troubling changes within himself that he could no longer ignore. What had once been simple fatigue after long council meetings had evolved into persistent exhaustion that no amount of rest seemed to relieve. His temper, previously controlled and measured, had grown short and unpredictable, causing tension among advisers who had once relied on his steady leadership. Margaret Holt, the head of his council, observed these changes with growing concern, though she said nothing directly, waiting instead for the right moment to address what she suspected was the true cause behind his decline. That moment arrived one evening when Damian collapsed suddenly during a routine training session, his body giving out without warning in front of several pack warriors. He was carried to his private chambers, where healers worked through the night trying to determine the cause of his sudden collapse, finding no physical injury or illness to explain what had happened. When Damian finally regained consciousness, Margaret was waiting at his bedside, her expression grave. "You know what this is," she said quietly, once the healers had left the room. Damian said nothing, his gaze fixed on the ceiling above him, refusing to meet her eyes. "A rejected bond does not simply disappear because you ward it away," Margaret continued, her voice firm despite its gentleness. "It festers. It weakens the one who caused the rejection just as surely as the one who was rejected." "I did what was necessary," Damian said finally, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. Necessary for the council, perhaps, Margaret replied. But not necessary for you. I have watched you decline for months, Damian. This is not simply exhaustion from your duties. This is your own body rebelling against a decision your heart never truly accepted. Damian remained silent, unwilling to admit the truth in her words, though the ache that had settled permanently in his chest since that night made denial increasingly difficult to sustain. Unbeknownst to him, that same week, a traveling merchant arrived at the Ashgrove trading post carrying news from the Northern Territories, news that would soon reach Damian's ears and shatter whatever fragile control he still believed he held over his emotions. The merchant spoke casually of a growing friendship between King Alaric Thornwood and a woman named Elena Voss, a friendship that had become the subject of increasing speculation throughout Ridgemere and the surrounding territories. When the news eventually reached Damian, delivered hesitantly by one of his advisors who feared his reaction, something inside him fractured in a way he had not anticipated. The exhaustion, the persistent ache, the growing instability he had refused to acknowledge, all of it crystallized suddenly into a single, undeniable realization. He had rejected Elena to protect his kingdom from complications he feared he could not control. Instead, his rejection had set into motion a chain of events that now threatened to take her away from him entirely, this time by her own choice rather than his cruel decision. For the first time since the ceremony, Damian allowed himself to fully feel the weight of what he had done, though he did not yet know whether that realization had come in time to change anything at all. Snow had begun to fall lightly over Ridgemere by the time Alaric arrived at Elena's small stone house, carrying with him a request far more significant than any trade discussion that had brought him there before. He knocked with unusual hesitation, a stark contrast to the calm confidence Elena had come to associate with him over the past several months. She opened the door and immediately noticed the tension in his posture, the careful way he seemed to be choosing his words even before speaking them. "Is something wrong?" she asked, stepping aside to let him in from the cold. "No," Alaric said quickly, though his voice carried an unfamiliar nervousness. "Nothing is wrong. I simply have something important I wish to discuss with you, if you are willing to hear it." Elena studied him carefully as she closed the door behind him, curiosity mixing with a faint apprehension she could not quite explain. "Of course," she said, gesturing toward the small table near the fireplace where they had shared countless conversations over the previous months. They sat across from each other, the fire crackling softly between them, casting warm light across Alaric's face as he gathered his thoughts. Elena had never seen him this uncertain before, and the change unsettled her slightly, though she waited patiently for him to speak. "I have spent the past several months traveling to Ridgemere under the pretense of trade negotiations," Alaric began slowly. "While those negotiations were genuine, I would be lying if I claimed they were my primary reason for returning so frequently." Elena's heart began to beat faster, though she remained silent, allowing him to continue. "I have come to care for you, Elena, in a way I did not expect and certainly did not plan for when we first met," he continued, his grey eyes steady despite the vulnerability evident in his voice. "Not because of fate, not because of some bond forced upon us by forces beyond our control, but because of who you are. Your strength, your intelligence, the way you rebuilt your life after enduring something that would have broken many others entirely." Elena felt her throat tighten with emotion, memories of the ceremony flashing briefly through her mind before she pushed them aside to focus fully on the man sitting before her. "I understand you carry wounds that may never fully heal," Alaric continued. "I do not ask you to forget what happened to you, nor do I expect you to feel toward me the same overwhelming pull that a fated bond might create. What I offer instead is a partnership built on choice, on mutual respect, and on genuine care that grows stronger through deliberate effort rather than forces neither of us controls." He reached into his coat and produced a small box, opening it carefully to reveal a simple silver ring, elegant but understated, nothing like the elaborate ceremonial jewelry Elena had seen displayed within royal courts before. "I am asking you to become my queen," Alaric said, his voice steady despite the weight of the words. "Not because destiny demands it, but because I have chosen you, deliberately and completely, and I hope you might choose me in return." Elena stared at the ring for a long moment, her mind racing through everything that had led her to this point, the humiliation of the ceremony, the months of solitary healing in Ridgemere, and the slow, unexpected growth of trust and affection that had blossomed through countless conversations with the man now kneeling before her with such open vulnerability. You understand what you are asking, Elena said quietly. Marrying me would mean aligning your kingdom with someone rejected by a rival territory. It could complicate your standing among your own council, perhaps even reignite old tensions between Thornwood and Ashgrove. I have considered all of that, Alaric replied firmly. And none of it changes what I feel or what I am offering you. I am not asking you to solve a political problem for me, Elena. I am asking because I want you beside me, as my equal, my partner, and my queen. Tears finally slipped down Elena's cheeks, though these tears felt entirely different from the ones she had shed the night of her rejection. These were tears born from being seen fully, valued completely, without conditions or hesitation. Yes, she said softly, her voice trembling with emotion. Yes, I will marry you. Relief and joy spread across Alaric's face as he slipped the ring onto her finger, rising to pull her into a gentle embrace that felt nothing like the desperate, painful pull of a fated bond, and everything like a deliberate choice made freely by two people who had found something real between them. News of their engagement spread quickly throughout both territories, carried by merchants and messengers eager to share such significant developments. Within Thornwood's court, reactions were largely positive, many advisors recognizing the potential benefits of strengthening alliances through Elena's practical knowledge of trade routes and border regions. Within Ashgrove territory, however, the news landed with far greater impact, especially upon reaching the ears of Damian himself. He received the news from Margaret Holt, who delivered it carefully, watching his reaction closely as she spoke. The Thornwood king has proposed marriage to Elena Voss, she said. The engagement has been formally announced throughout both territories. Damian said nothing for a long moment, his hands clenching into fists at his side as the reality of the situation settled over him with crushing weight. He had spent months trying to convince himself that his rejection had been necessary, that his kingdom's stability depended on prioritizing political obligations over the overwhelming pull of a fated bond. Yet now, faced with the reality that Elena had moved forward entirely, choosing another man, another kingdom, another future entirely separate from him, the justifications he had clung to for months suddenly felt hollow and meaningless. I need to see her, Damian said finally, his voice rough with an emotion he had spent months suppressing. Margaret's expression remained cautious. Damian, think carefully about what you intend to do. Elena has built a new life. She has found happiness with someone who has treated her with the respect and consideration you failed to offer during the ceremony. Interfering now could cause far more damage than good, both to her and to the stability of our own territory. I am not asking for your approval, Damian replied sharply, his frustration finally breaking through the composed exterior he had maintained since her departure. I need to speak with her before this marriage takes place. I owe her that much, at the very least. Margaret studied him for a long moment, recognizing the futility of arguing further once his mind had been set. Then go, she said finally. But understand, Damian, whatever you say to her, she is under no obligation to listen, nor to change the path she has chosen for herself. Damian nodded, though the warning did little to ease the storm of emotions churning within him. He departed Ashgrove territory that same evening, riding hard through the darkness toward the border town where Elena had rebuilt her entire life without him. The journey took several days, each hour weighing heavily on him as memories of the ceremony replayed endlessly in his mind, alongside imagined scenarios of what he might say once he finally stood before her again. He rehearsed apologies, explanations, justifications, discarding each one as inadequate compared to the magnitude of what he had done. By the time he arrived in Ridgemere, exhaustion had settled deep into his bones, though it did little to diminish the urgency driving him forward. He made his way directly toward the modest inn where he had learned Alaric often stayed during his visits, hoping to find Elena somewhere nearby. Instead, he found himself intercepted by palace guards from Thornwood territory, stationed discreetly throughout the town as part of increased security following the announcement of the royal engagement. State your business, one guard said firmly, stepping forward to block Damian's path. I am here to speak with Elena Voss, Damian replied, his voice carrying the authority he had grown accustomed to wielding within his own territory, though it seemed to have little effect on the guard standing before him. Miss Voss is not receiving visitors without prior arrangement, the guard replied firmly. Especially not visitors arriving unannounced from rival territories. Damian's frustration mounted, though he forced himself to remain composed, recognizing that aggression would only worsen his situation. "Please," he said, his voice softening slightly. "I only need a few moments. It concerns a matter of significant personal importance." The guards exchanged uncertain glances, clearly recognizing Damian despite his attempt to travel discreetly, understanding the political implications of turning away an Alpha King entirely. Eventually, word was sent ahead to Elena, informing her of Damian's unexpected arrival and his request for a private conversation. Elena received the news with a mixture of shock and quiet determination, her initial instinct to refuse entirely giving way to a decision to face him directly, to finally close the chapter that had haunted her for months. She agreed to meet him, though she insisted the conversation take place in a public location, ensuring that whatever occurred between them would happen with appropriate boundaries firmly established. They met near the same river where Alaric had first found her sitting alone months earlier, the water now partially frozen along its edges, reflecting the pale winter sunlight filtering through overcast skies. Damian arrived first, pacing anxiously along the riverbank until Elena appeared, walking toward him with measured, deliberate steps that betrayed none of the nervousness she felt internally. "Elena," Damian said, his voice catching slightly as he finally stood before her again after months of separation. "Damian," she replied evenly, her expression carefully controlled despite the storm of memories his presence stirred within her. "I heard about your engagement," he said, unable to keep the pain from bleeding into his voice. "I needed to see you before everything becomes final." Elena studied him carefully, noting the exhaustion etched into his features, the weight he seemed to be carrying far beyond simple travel fatigue. "Why are you really here, Damian?" He hesitated, memories of rehearsed speeches abandoning him entirely as he stood before her, the reality of the situation far more overwhelming than he had anticipated during his journey. "I made a mistake," he said finally, the words raw and unguarded. "I let fear and obligation dictate a decision that should have been guided by something far more important." "And what would that be?" Elena asked, her voice steady despite the emotions rising within her chest. "You," Damian said simply. "I let you go because I was afraid of what accepting the bond might cost me politically. I convinced myself that stability mattered more than what my own heart demanded. I was wrong, Elena. I have been in pain since that night, pain that has only grown worse with each passing day." Elena felt a complicated mixture of vindication and sorrow rise within her, though she remained firmly grounded in the strength she had built over the past several months. "You had your chance, Damian. You stood before your entire pack and chose pride over partnership. You cannot simply arrive now, months later, and expect that pain to erase the consequences of that choice." "I am not asking you to forget what happened," Damian said, desperation creeping into his voice. "I am asking for a chance to make things right, to show you that I have changed, that I understand now what I failed to understand then." Elena shook her head slowly, though not unkindly. "Damian, I spent months rebuilding myself after you discarded me in front of everyone who mattered to you. I found strength I did not know I possessed. I found someone who values me not because fate demanded it, but because he chose to, deliberately and consistently, every single day since we met." "Alaric," Damian said, the name carrying bitter weight as it left his lips. "Yes, Alaric," Elena confirmed. "He never made me feel like a burden, Damian. He never once made me question my worth. That is something you failed to offer me, even when fate itself demanded it of you." Damian's shoulders slumped, the full weight of his mistake finally settling over him with undeniable clarity. "I understand," he said quietly. "I cannot undo what I did that night. I only wish for you to know that my rejection was never a reflection of your worth, but rather a reflection of my own fear and weakness." Elena felt a measure of compassion stir within her, though it did nothing to change her resolve. "Thank you for saying that," she said gently. "But my future is no longer tied to what happened between us, Damian. I have chosen a different path, one built on genuine partnership rather than obligation forced upon us by fate." Damian nodded slowly, accepting the finality in her words even as pain continued to churn within his chest. "I wish you happiness, Elena. Truly. Even if it is not happiness found beside me." "Thank you," Elena replied softly, and for the first time since the ceremony, she felt a genuine sense of closure settle over the wound that had haunted her for so long. As Damian turned to leave, walking slowly back toward the path that would carry him home to Ashgrove territory, Elena remained by the river for a long while, watching the water continue its steady flow toward destinations unknown, much like her own life had continued forward despite the pain that once threatened to consume her entirely. When she finally returned to her small stone house, she found Alaric waiting for her, concern evident in his expression as he studied her carefully. "How did it go?" he asked gently. "It is finished," Elena said, a quiet strength settling into her voice. "Truly finished, this time." Alaric pulled her into a gentle embrace, relief washing over him as he held her close. "Whatever happens next, Elena, know that I am here, choosing you every single day, exactly as I promised." "I know," Elena whispered against his chest, feeling for the first time in months a sense of peace that had nothing to do with fate, and everything to do with deliberate, genuine choice. The weeks following Damian's visit to Ridgemere brought a strange, uneasy calm to Elena's life, though calm was not a word many within Thornwood's court would have used to describe the political undercurrent stirring beneath the surface. While Elena and Alaric moved forward with wedding preparations, whispers of Damian's unexpected journey to Ridgemere had already begun spreading through both territories, twisted and exaggerated by the time they reached certain ears within Thornwood's council. Lord Edwin Marsh, one of the more traditional members of Alaric's council, had never fully supported the idea of his king marrying a woman previously rejected by a rival Alpha. He viewed the union as unnecessarily risky, a potential source of ongoing tension between Thornwood and Ashgrove territories rather than the stabilizing alliance Alaric hoped it might become. When news of Damian's visit reached Edwin, he wasted no time bringing his concerns directly to Alaric. "Your Majesty," Edwin said, standing stiffly before Alaric's private study, "I must express my continued reservations regarding this upcoming marriage. The Ashgrove king traveled here personally, uninvited, to speak with your intended bride. Such actions suggest unresolved feelings that could threaten the stability of our kingdom should tensions escalate further." Alaric regarded Edwin calmly, though a flicker of irritation crossed his features. "Elena handled that conversation with grace and clarity, Edwin. She made her position clear, and Damian departed without incident. I fail to see how this threatens anything." "With respect, my king," Edwin pressed, "the very fact that he felt entitled to arrive unannounced demonstrates a lack of respect for the boundaries you and Elena have established. Should he attempt further interference, particularly as the wedding draws closer, the consequences could extend far beyond a private conversation by a riverbank." Alaric's jaw tightened, though he forced himself to consider Edwin's concerns rationally rather than dismissing them outright. "What would you have me do, Edwin? Cancel the wedding based on speculation about a rival king's unresolved feelings?" "No," Edwin admitted. "But perhaps increased precautions are warranted. Additional security around the wedding preparations, careful monitoring of any further contact between Ashgrove representatives and Elena, and a clear message sent to Damian himself, establishing firm boundaries regarding future interactions." Alaric considered this for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Increased security, I can agree to. As for a message to Damian, I believe that conversation has already occurred, quite clearly, from Elena herself. I will not insult her strength by assuming she requires my intervention to reinforce boundaries she has already established." Edwin bowed slightly, accepting the compromise despite his lingering reservations. "As you wish, Your Majesty. I only hope this situation resolves without further complication." Unbeknownst to both men, complications were already brewing far beyond their immediate control. Within Ashgrove territory, Damian's return from Ridgemere had done little to ease the internal turmoil plaguing him. If anything, witnessing Elena's newfound happiness and unwavering resolve had deepened the ache within his chest, transforming what had once been simple regret into something closer to desperate longing. Margaret Holt observed his continued decline with growing alarm, watching as sleepless nights and diminished appetite began taking a visible toll on his health and leadership capabilities. Council meetings that once ran smoothly under his steady guidance had become disorganized, decisions delayed, tensions rising among advisors uncertain how to proceed without clear direction from their king. "Damian," Margaret said one evening, finding him alone in his study, staring blankly at reports he had clearly not read despite the paper spread across his desk. "This cannot continue. Your pack needs a king capable of leading, not one consumed by regret over a choice that cannot be undone." "I know," Damian said quietly, though the acknowledgement did little to change his current state. I simply do not know how to move forward from this. Perhaps, Margaret suggested carefully, you might consider that moving forward does not require forgetting what happened, but rather accepting it fully and redirecting your energy toward rebuilding what remains within your control. Damian looked up at her, exhaustion evident in his eyes. What if I cannot fully accept it? What if this ache never fades? Margaret's expression softened slightly, sympathy mixing with her usual firm resolve. Then you learn to carry it, Damian, the same way many before you have learned to carry losses that never fully disappear. But you cannot allow that weight to destroy everything you have built, nor everything your pack still depends upon you to protect. Her words, though difficult to hear, planted a seed of clarity within Damian's exhausted mind. He recognized, slowly and painfully, that his continued decline served no purpose beyond deepening his own suffering while simultaneously endangering the stability of the pack he had sworn to protect. Over the following weeks, Damian began the difficult process of confronting his choices honestly, seeking counsel not only from Margaret but from Nora Whitfield, the healer who had first tended to Elena's pain on the night of the rejection. Nora, though initially hesitant given her sympathy for Elena's suffering, agreed to help Damian understand the physical and emotional toll that severed bonds often carried for both parties involved. The pain you feel is real, Nora explained during one of their sessions, but it is not permanent in the way you might fear. Bonds, even broken ones, eventually settle into something more manageable, provided the individual actively works toward healing rather than remaining trapped within regret. How do I begin that process? Damian asked, genuine vulnerability evident in his voice for perhaps the first time since the ceremony. By accepting responsibility fully, without excuses, Nora replied firmly. And by recognizing that Elena's happiness, wherever she has found it, does not diminish your own worth or your capacity to lead effectively moving forward. Slowly, painstakingly, Damian began implementing changes within his own life and leadership. He delegated certain responsibilities to trusted advisors, allowing himself necessary time to focus on physical and emotional recovery. He began engaging more directly with pack members beyond formal council meetings, listening to their concerns and rebuilding trust that had eroded during his months of instability. Meanwhile, back in Ridgemere, wedding preparations continued steadily, Elena finding herself increasingly absorbed in the practical details of merging two territories through a union built on mutual respect and genuine partnership. She worked closely with Thornwood's council to develop new trade agreements that would benefit both territories, drawing upon her extensive knowledge of border regions and merchant routes. One afternoon, while reviewing proposed trade routes with several Thornwood advisors, Elena encountered Edwin Marsh directly for the first time since his private conversation with Alaric regarding Damian's visit. Miss Voss, Edwin said, his tone polite though carrying an underlying formality that suggested lingering reservations. I wish to speak with you directly regarding recent events. Elena regarded him carefully, sensing the tension beneath his measured words. Of course, Lord Marsh. What concerns you? I understand the Ashgrove King traveled here recently to speak with you privately, Edwin said. I wish to understand your perspective on this development, particularly given the implications it may carry for the stability of your upcoming marriage. Elena appreciated Edwin's directness, recognizing the genuine concern underlying his cautious approach. Lord Marsh, I assure you, that conversation provided closure, nothing more. I made clear to Damian that my future lies here, with Alaric, built upon choices we have made deliberately and together. And should he attempt further contact? Edwin pressed. Then I will handle it exactly as I did before, Elena replied firmly. With clarity and resolve. I did not survive months of rebuilding my life simply to allow old wounds to dictate my future now. Edwin studied her for a long moment, something shifting within his previously guarded expression. Forgive my initial reservations, Miss Voss. I see now the strength that clearly drew our king's admiration in the first place. Elena offered a small, genuine smile. Thank you, Lord Marsh. I hope, in time, we might build the same mutual respect between us as I have found with Alaric himself. As the wedding date approached, tensions between the two territories gradually eased, largely due to Elena's continued diplomatic efforts and Damian's own quiet withdrawal from any further attempts at interference. Reports reaching Thornwood indicated that the Ashgrove king had begun focusing entirely on internal matters, his health and leadership slowly stabilizing under Margaret's careful guidance. Elena received occasional updates regarding Damian's progress, delivered discreetly through neutral messengers who maintained communication between the territories for practical trade purposes. While she felt a measure of relief knowing he had begun healing, she remained firmly focused on her own future, refusing to allow lingering concern for his well-being to distract from the life she had built alongside Alaric. One evening, just weeks before the wedding, Alaric found Elena sitting quietly in the palace gardens, her expression thoughtful as she gazed up at the stars beginning to emerge across the darkening sky. "You seem lost in thought," Alaric said, settling beside her on the stone bench. "I was simply reflecting," Elena admitted, "on how far I have come since that night at the ceremony. I never imagined I would find myself here, preparing to marry a king who chose me not because fate demanded it, but because he genuinely wanted to." Alaric took her hand gently, warmth spreading through the simple gesture. "I imagined that journey was far more difficult than most could understand." "It was," Elena agreed. "But I would not change it, not entirely. Without that pain, I might never have discovered the strength I now carry, nor found my way toward the genuine partnership I have built with you." "Do you still think of him?" Alaric asked, his tone carrying curiosity rather than jealousy. Elena considered the question honestly before answering. "Occasionally, though not with the pain that once consumed me. I hope he finds peace eventually, whatever form that takes. But my future belongs here, with you, built upon choices we have made deliberately, together." Alaric leaned forward, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "Then let us continue building that future, Elena, exactly as we have chosen to." As the final weeks before the wedding unfolded, both territories settled into a fragile but genuine peace, built not upon forced alliances or fated bonds, but upon deliberate choices made by individuals determined to move forward despite the pain of their past. Elena, once humiliated and discarded, now stood on the threshold of a future entirely of her own making, surrounded by genuine respect, mutual understanding, and a partnership built to last well beyond the fleeting pull of fate itself. The morning of Elena's wedding arrived beneath a sky washed clean by early spring rain, the gardens of Thornwood Palace bursting with fresh blossoms that had opened seemingly overnight in celebration of the union about to take place. Elena stood before a tall mirror in her private chambers, studying her reflection as Nora Whitfield, who had traveled from Ashgrove specifically for this purpose, carefully arranged the final details of her wedding attire. "You look radiant," Nora said softly, adjusting a delicate string of pearls woven through Elena's hair. "Nothing like the woman I found weeping beneath that old oak tree all those months ago." Elena smiled gently, memories of that painful night resurfacing briefly before settling back into the distant past where they belonged. "I owe much of my healing to you, Nora. Your kindness that night gave me the strength to take those first steps forward." "You found that strength within yourself," Nora corrected gently. "I merely offered a moment of comfort along the way." Before the ceremony began, however, Elena had one final matter to attend to, a private ritual she had arranged weeks earlier with the assistance of Thornwood's most respected spiritual advisor, an elderly woman named Agnes Fenwick, known throughout the kingdom for her deep knowledge of ancient bonding rituals passed down through countless generations. Elena made her way quietly to a secluded chamber within the palace, where Agnes waited beside a small ceremonial altar adorned with candles and carefully arranged herbs known for their properties in matters concerning fate and destiny. "Are you certain you wish to proceed with this?" Agnes asked, studying Elena carefully as she entered the room. "Yes," Elena said firmly. "I have carried the remnants of that broken bond for too long. Today, I wish to sever it completely, freeing myself entirely before I commit myself fully to Alaric." Agnes nodded, understanding the significance behind Elena's request. While rejected mate bonds naturally weaken over time, they rarely disappeared entirely without deliberate intervention, often leaving faint traces capable of causing distress during significant emotional moments, precisely the kind of moment Elena now prepared to enter. "This ritual will not be without discomfort," Agnes warned. "Severing what remains of a fated bond, even one already rejected, requires confronting the raw emotions still tied to its formation. But once complete, you will be entirely free, unburdened by any lingering connection to your past." Elena took a steadying breath, nodding with quiet determination. I am ready. Agnes guided her through the ritual carefully, instructing Elena to hold a small, smooth stone infused with specific herbs while reciting words meant to formally release any remaining thread connecting her to the bond ignited that fateful night. As Elena spoke the words, she felt a strange warmth spread through her chest, followed by an intense wave of memories, the ignition of the bond, the crushing rejection, the months of painful healing, all resurfacing briefly before beginning to fade, like smoke dispersing into open air. The sensation intensified as she continued the ritual, tears streaming down her cheeks not from renewed pain, but from the profound release washing over her, a final closing of the wound that had once threatened to define her entirely. By the time the ritual concluded, Elena felt lighter than she had in months, an unmistakable sense of freedom settling deep within her chest, entirely unburdened by whatever remnants of the fated bond had lingered silently beneath the surface of her healed exterior. It is done, Agnes said softly, observing the visible shift in Elena's demeanor. You are free now, Elena, in every sense that matters. Elena wiped away her tears, a genuine smile spreading across her face as she rose from the ceremonial altar. Thank you, Agnes. I could not have entered this marriage fully without completing this final step. Far away, within Ashgrove territory, Damian experienced an unusual sensation that same morning, a final, faint pull within his chest suddenly releasing entirely, leaving behind not pain, but a strange, unexpected sense of peace. He did not know precisely what had caused the shift, though somewhere deep within him, he understood instinctively that whatever remained of the bond between himself and Elena had finally been severed completely. Standing alone on his balcony, watching the morning sun rise steadily over his territory, Damian allowed himself a rare moment of genuine acceptance. He thought of Elena, hoping sincerely that she had found the happiness she deserved, recognizing finally that his own path forward required building a legacy defined by his own strength and leadership, rather than remaining tethered to regret over choices long since made and consequences long since accepted. Meanwhile, back within Thornwood Palace, preparations for the wedding ceremony reached their final stages. Guests from both territories, along with neutral observers eager to witness the historic union between two previously rival kingdoms, gathered within the Grand Hall, anticipation building steadily as the ceremony start drew near. Alaric stood at the front of the hall, dressed in formal attire befitting his position, his grey eyes reflecting genuine excitement rather than the nervousness that had characterized his earlier proposal months before. Beside him stood Edwin Marsh, who had gradually transformed from skeptic to genuine supporter of the union, recognizing the strength and wisdom Elena consistently demonstrated throughout the preparations leading up to this momentous day. When Elena finally appeared at the entrance of the Grand Hall, dressed in an elegant gown adorned with delicate silver embroidery reminiscent of Thornwood's own royal colors, a hushed silence fell over the assembled guests, quickly followed by murmurs of admiration at the radiant confidence she carried with each measured step forward. Alaric's expression softened into unmistakable joy as she approached, his eyes never leaving hers as she made her way steadily toward him, the final steps of a journey that had begun with devastating rejection and now culminated in a genuine, deliberate choice made freely by two individuals determined to build something lasting together. The ceremony itself proceeded smoothly, officiated by Agnes Fenwick herself, who spoke eloquently of partnerships built not upon forces beyond one's control, but upon deliberate choices reinforced daily through mutual respect, genuine affection, and unwavering commitment. As Elena and Alaric exchanged their vows, promising not blind devotion dictated by fate, but conscious, continual choice reaffirmed through every day of their future together, Elena felt an overwhelming sense of completion settle within her chest, entirely different from the desperate ache she had once associated with fated bonds and their potential to define one's worth entirely. When Agnes finally pronounced them formally united as King and Queen of Thornwood, the Grand Hall erupted into celebration, guests from both territories rising together in genuine applause, symbolizing not merely the union of two individuals, but the beginning of a new era of cooperation and understanding between kingdoms long divided by old grievances and misplaced pride. Following the ceremony, as celebrations continued late into the evening, Elena found a quiet moment alone with Alaric on the palace balcony overlooking the gardens below, now illuminated softly by countless lanterns hung specifically for the occasion. How does it feel, Alaric asked gently, to finally reach this moment? Elena considered the question thoughtfully before answering. It feels like freedom, she said finally. Not simply from the pain of my past, but freedom to build a future entirely of my own choosing, alongside someone who chose me just as deliberately in return. Alaric pulled her close, resting his forehead gently against hers. I will continue choosing you, Elena, every single day, for as long as we both shall live. As will I, Elena replied softly, her voice carrying the quiet strength she had cultivated through months of hardship and eventual healing. As they stood together beneath the star-filled sky, celebrating not merely their union but the beginning of an entirely new chapter defined by deliberate partnership rather than uncontrollable fate, Elena finally understood the true nature of what she had sought all along. She had not needed a bond forced upon her by forces beyond her control to find genuine belonging. She had needed only the courage to walk away from rejection, to rebuild herself entirely on her own terms, and ultimately to recognize genuine partnership when it appeared before her, offered freely and without conditions. Far from Thornwood's celebrations, within the quiet halls of Ashgrove territory, Damian continued his own path forward, gradually rebuilding his leadership and reputation among his pack, guided by lessons learned through painful experience rather than fate's uncontrollable pull. He would never forget the consequences of prioritizing pride over genuine connection, nor would he ever again dismiss the value of choices made deliberately rather than obligations imposed by forces beyond his control. In time, both territories would come to view the union between Thornwood and Ashgrove's rejected mate as a turning point in their long history of tension, a reminder that genuine strength often emerges not from destiny fulfilled, but from courage exercised in the face of devastating rejection. Elena Voss, once humiliated and discarded before hundreds of witnesses, had transformed her pain into unshakable resolve, ultimately finding not merely happiness, but genuine partnership built entirely upon deliberate choice rather than fate's uncertain promise. And as she stood beside Alaric that evening, celebrating a future built entirely on their own terms, she understood with absolute certainty that she had finally found exactly where she belonged, not because destiny demanded it, but because she had chosen it herself, completely and without regret.